Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to see you. Welcome back. It's time for Global Solutions again, and that means it's time for the Global Solutions Summit 2021. My name is Katie Gallos, and I'm very happy and pleased to be your moderator of today, because the question that we already tackled yesterday, how will the post-COVID-19 world look like, will also be the overall question for today. Do we go back to our old ways, or will the pandemic be our momentum to tackle these most urgent issues that we are facing right now? Again, like yesterday, today we will be focusing on research-based policy recommendations for the T20, the G20, and of course beyond. And we're very happy to read your tweets, so please join the conversation with the hashtag Global Solutions. And the Global Solutions Summit, as you all know, it's based on more than 20 keynotes from all over the world. More than 40 multi-stakeholder panels are currently online, and over, 5,000 registered participants from more than 100 countries in the world. 2 days full of program. We're heading into our second day. So thanks again to all the partners and supporters who are making this very special virtual conference possible. And we are going to start into our second day, as I mentioned, as we speak today with German Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel, with the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, and of course the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. But now I hand over to Professor Dennis Snower, who's the president of the Global Solutions Initiative.
And now for the highlight of the Global Solutions Summit. It's my sincere and deep pleasure and honor to welcome two outstanding statespeople who have contributed very substantially to the cause of multilateralism to address major global challenges. The Global Solutions Initiative grew out of the T20 process that I had the privilege to co-lead under the German G20 presidency. And the leadership of Chancellor Merkel inspired us to bring together researchers from all over the world to address G20 priorities. Chancellor Merkel, it is a great pleasure to see you. Frau Dr. Merkel, es freut mich enorm, Sie im Kreis von...
Madam Chancellor, I am enormously pleased to be able to welcome you yet again in the, for me as well. It's a great pleasure for me as well to be with you today.
The stage is yours.
Chancellor has the floor. Well, Professor Snower, Mr. President, dear Mario, ladies and gentlemen who join us, at least via their screens, life is what you make it. There's a lot of truth in this conventional wisdom. And in many ways, this is also truth for nations, but it's still only half the truth. Mario, can you hear me? Can you hear the translation?
Okay, very good.
Very good. This is true for the whole world because the well-being of countries across borders, across continents, is sort of an interdependency. It depends on the actions of others. And the pandemic has brought this home again to us. The world is a community of destiny, be it global health, be it issues of climate, environmental protection, sustainable development. There is certainly no lack of great challenges that the world faces together and that we can only master together. But we all know also that multilateralism is not a given. It's not to be taken for granted. In order to understand multilateralism, multilateralism as an instrument to promote common progress. It needs to be accepted. It needs to be filled with life. It needs suitable formats for this. And the Global Solutions Summit is one of those formats because, after all, the name in many ways is a program during the during the German G20 presidency in 2017. This meeting took place for the first time. It's a well-established part of the G20 process, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to participate in this together with Minister President Draghi, dear Mario, by hosting the G20 Global Health Summit last Friday. You showed very clearly that the G20 is ready as regards pressing global issues to work together, and I can only assure you of my comprehensive support for a successful G20 presidency under your leadership. Yes, certainly G20 cannot solve each and every problem all over the world, but once the 20 leading industrialized nations work together, they can do a lot towards improving the global common weal. And this is not least true for cooperation against the COVID-19 pandemic that has put international cooperation to a particular test, be it about development, production, or distribution of vaccines. The more we pool our resources, the more promising is, and this is not least true for cooperation against the COVID-19 pandemic that has put international cooperation to a particular test, be it about development, production, or distribution of vaccines. The more we pool our resources, the more promising is the fight against COVID-19, the more can we be assured of success. And that is also true, obviously, for future infectious diseases, because we will have to contend with them rising again. In 2015 and 2017, Germany placed the issues of global health and pandemic preparedness on the agenda of G7 and G20. We're able now to build on the results and achievements of this, but I must say that I would have very much wished for an even more consistent preparation to this pandemic. Although it's true that at the time, obviously, no one would probably have been able to imagine that this issue would become so pressing. The pandemic shows that all of the attempts to fight them at the national level will simply not be sufficient, and indeed cannot be sufficient in order to overcome the COVID-19 crisis. We need to assure access to all countries, access that is to was able to distribute vaccine doses to 125 countries, more than 71 million doses, but obviously there is a much greater need. And this is why Germany, during the Global Health Summit, committed itself to give 30 million doses to developing countries, and I can only call upon all our G20 partners to do their utmost to support ACTA and COVAX, because there's not a lack of funding only for the distribution of vaccines, but also for increasing production. And here too, the partners in Europe, in the G7 and the G20 are called upon to promote the buildup of global production capacities. To this end, under the roof of COVAX, a new working group, a task force was established in South Africa, and Germany are co-hosts, and I support this task force wholeheartedly. And the current coping with this crisis is already a gigantic task, but in the future, there will be further virus mutations, there will be new pathogens coming up, and this is why we need to prepare as well as we can to further pandemic threats. So we should not reduce incentives for R&D, but rather we ought to maintain it. Patent protection plays a very important role in this respect. And against this background, we need to explore every avenue so that the benefits of the development of new vaccines and medication for crisis prevention, obviously, it's most important to strengthen WHO as the central institution for promoting global health. And there is a need for global action, not only as regards questions of coping with pandemics and preparing for pandemics. We also need to strengthen our societies, our economies as a whole, and make them more sustainable. So for very good reasons, this year we have conferences, very important conferences on international climate and environmental protection, and I expect a very strong message from the G20, particularly since its member states are, after all, responsible for about 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We urgently need progress if future generations are to also have the opportunity to live in an environment worth living in. And this will best be achieved if climate protection becomes a factor of economic success. And we need to put the necessary incentives in place. In this question too, G7 and G20 are important formats to forge a global consensus. Unfortunately, if we look at Agenda 2030, we have to say that we have not made the progress recently due to the pandemic that we wanted to have in promoting SDGs, particularly as regards combating poverty, achieving food security and education, and combating inequalities, and in particular and also in gender equality. We see rather a rollback instead of progress. And the same goes for free and fair trade, an issue that also has a lot to do with sustainable development. So reform and strengthening of WTO is all the more important, and I hope that the issues that are still outstanding can be clarified as soon as possible with the new US administration. There is reason for hope, for example, the African Continental Free Trade area, and also the Compact with Africa that we established under the G20 presidency of Germany in 2017 is already having an effect. And the economy of African Compact partner countries has proved itself to be remarkably resilient. Italy will, continue the tradition of the Compact, and I'm truly grateful for this to you, Mario. We will have to contend with the economic distortions due to the pandemic for quite some time. So global indebtedness too will remain an issue on the Italian G20 agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, it should be obvious to all of us that global issues can only be solved globally. But for this, we need to consistently effort to convince others. And obviously, we can only be convincing if we come up with effective and efficient solutions. And Global Solutions Summit is a good platform for this. All of you who are making an input with your knowledge, with your expertise, very important in this context. And I wish all of us an inspiring discussion. Thank you.
Because it makes an important point that we must all take to heart, which is when we face global problems, they can only be tackled globally. And so ACTA, COVAX, WHO is the relevant place to tackle a pandemic. And it is extraordinary how already in 2017, under the German G20 presidency, these topics with regard to health were put on the agenda, including antimicrobial resistance, which is a topic that should concern us a lot more. Our next speaker is Prime Minister Mario Draghi, whom I welcome. He has played a central role, the central role in stabilizing the European economy and financial system on the monetary front. And now he is doing it on many, many more fronts as head of state of Italy and host of the G20. So Prime Minister Draghi, wonderful to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, President Snower. Dear Chancellor, dear Angela, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to take part in this year's Global Solutions Summit. This event takes place at a time of profound change in global relations. The past few years saw a pause in the process of globalization. In many countries, citizens embraced sovereignism and nativism as the answer to their political and economic anxieties. The COVID-19 pandemic hit an increasingly divided world. As governments struggled with their own lack of preparedness, the temptation was to blame others and turn inward for protection. However, multilateralism is now bouncing back. The health crisis has taught us that it's impossible to address global problems with domestic solutions. The same applies to other defining challenges of our times, climate change and global inequalities. At this year's presidency of the G20, Italy is determined to lead a change in the paradigm. The world needs the world, not a collection of individual states. Our collective priority is, of course, to bring the pandemic to an end. This means everywhere and not just in the rich world. There is a moral imperative to ensure that the poorest countries have access to effective vaccines. But there is also a practical and, if you want, self-serving reason. So long as the pandemic rages on, the virus can undergo dangerous mutations that can undermine even the most successful vaccination campaign. The Global Health Summit in Rome last week offered a set of very concrete responses to this crisis. The generous pledges from individual countries, and I want to underline, from pharmaceutical companies, therefore from the private sector, ensure that we speed up the global vaccination campaign. The EU initiative aimed at building vaccine manufacturing capacity in low and middle-income countries helps Africa deal with many diseases, not just COVID-19. And the Rome Declaration presents a very useful set of principles to make sure that the global community is better prepared to take the next pandemic. The battle against the virus cannot distract our attention from the fight against climate change. Polar ice sheets are melting and the sea level is rising. The number of reported weather-related natural disasters has more than trebled since 1960s, and these events are bound to intensify in the coming decades. In low and middle-income countries, natural disasters cost a staggering $390 billion a year. The World Health Organization projects that between 2030 and 2050, climate change will cause 250,000 deaths per year. Italy is co-chair of the COP26 in partnership with the United Kingdom. We have two clear aims. The first is to commit to emission reduction targets that are ambitious enough to limit global warming below 1.5 degrees and to reach net zero emissions by 2050. The second is to moderate potential damages associated with climate change. We need to strengthen our mitigation measures, for example, accelerating the phasing out of coal. And we need to ensure that more public and private capital flows to climate-related initiatives. In Europe, the Next Generation EU program offers a unique opportunity to embrace the environmental transition. But we need to do more at the global level. And for example, as Angela's just hinted at, through the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. Finally, we must take decisive action to tackle global inequalities. The health and climate crisis risk worsening the existing disparities. The pandemic has contributed to pushing at least 88 million people into extreme poverty in 2020. Climate change could push a further 132 million people over the next 10 years, according to the World Bank. These effects are skewed against younger workers and women. The International Monetary Fund notes that the pandemic shock has hit the youth harder. Women in emerging markets have seen a higher rise in unemployment and a larger drop in participation than men. Italy is endorsing a 4-point plan to address the plight of low-income economies. We support initiatives to reduce the debt burdens of the world's poorest countries. We want the International Monetary Fund to issue new special drawing rights and to relocate existing ones to help countries in need. We back the early replenishment of the International Development Association, and we encourage multilateral development banks to enhance their financing initiatives. Moreover, we want to take specific action on the issue of food security. For example, during the joint session between Foreign Affairs and Development Ministers at the G20 summit in June in Matera. Throughout history, Italy has thrived thanks to trade and international cooperation. Openness has been our best recipe for success. Our G20 presidency will reflect this long-standing commitment. Together with Germany and the other G20 partners, we are confident we can build a stronger world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Draghi. Prime Minister Draghi. Thank you, Chancellor Merkel. My name is Melissa Eddy, and I am honored to be here as part of the Global Solutions, and certainly with two leaders who have shown in not so long ago that they are willing to both do whatever it takes to schaffen das, or achieve that which needed to be achieved in the face of a great challenges like those we're facing right now in the wake of the global pandemic. And we've been talking a lot, both of you have raised the idea of the chance that we have to revive multilateralism right now with the return of the United States to the global discussion. But at the same time, we're seeing a nationalism returning in the face of the pandemic. We're seeing borders going up in Europe. We're seeing nationalism surrounding vaccines. So I wanted to ask each of you, and Chancellor Merkel, let's start with you. What specifically do you think steps could be taken to ensure that some of these lofty goals that we talk about in these discussions can really lead to the forming of things ahead?
Well, as I see it, I believe that the lessons we have learned from this crisis are undoubtedly going to change our outlook on globalization. And I think it will influence developments in the following two ways. Take, for example, the European Union and the question of sovereignty. What do we want to be able to do on our own with regard to the production of medical goods, for example, but also with regard to other issues? This question or issue of our own sovereignty is going to play a more prominent part. And we are talking about this these days. We are talking about the kind of vaccine production we want to set up in Europe. We also want to shape our digital sovereignty. And we are also talking about what that actually means. But at the same time, we realize that there is a thin line that we need to draw with respect to protectionism. Thus, we have to be very clear in making the point that we don't intend to do everything on our own, because it's going to be a throwback for the world at large. But we want to see a global competition about the best outcome, which is to say that if we want to ensure that global supply chains and multilateralism is maintained, because we need those global supply chains, we need agreements that are also resilient to crisis, that are reliable. We have to have the guarantee that even in a crisis, people not all of a sudden say that, well, I'm going to keep everything because my people need it. We need to have a minimum of things agreed. We need to be able to rely on these in times of crisis. And then we have to focus on those areas where we can perhaps think a little bit more of ourselves, but we need to be able to plan this way ahead. Not others ought to be doing it on our behalf. I believe that the European Union is a space now, has become a space where we should not focus on producing vaccines to vaccinate the members of the European Union, but also to vaccinate others. And I do have to say that I do take pride in the fact that we are exporting vaccines to others. I think we need to reach global agreements on these issues.
These global discussions that are necessary to move this ahead. Could you hear me? Yes?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes. I mean, the pandemic certainly exposed some limitations of globalization and some weaknesses. We didn't have shared protocols. We didn't share information for quite a time at the beginning of the process. So there were all kinds of problems among states. But that shows to me not so much the weakness of multilateralism, but the fact that we didn't have it enough multilateralism. And in fact, the response through an unprecedentedly fast production of vaccines, and all in all, especially from a European side, the sharing and the exports of these vaccines, let's never forget that we export about half of what we produce to countries that until now, even today, don't export anything or have blocked all exports. But basically on our side, there was a convinced sharing of multilateralism, which in the end provided the right response. So multilateralism was weak at the beginning because there wasn't enough of it. The response is actually a multilateral response. And what Angela said is absolutely right. I completely agree with her. The EU is a new space, has shown its sovereignty in the vaccine campaign, it's shown its sovereignty in the production of vaccines. But I think this shared sovereignty will touch many other fields. And the external developments, the foreign affairs developments, international relations developments, only show how we need a joint sovereignty in Europe in many fields, besides the health area. Thank you.
Thank you. So the idea almost of taking this pandemic and using it as a launching point for what we're learning to take it further into other fields. On that note, Chancellor Merkel, you mentioned a couple of things regarding vaccines, research and development, the need for investment there. There's been a global discussion about patents and patents for vaccines. Now, you touched on this talking about COVAX, the ACT program within COVAX, which is facing an urgent funding gap of $2 billion at the same time as Western nations are struggling to fill that. How do you propose concretely that we're able to get a vaccine strategy for the future set up where we can ensure financing and production and distribution equality amongst all nations, also in regards to the idea if patents remain protected?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we still need much more than the 2 billion euros you mentioned, but we have found that it doesn't help a lot to have a lot of money in the account of COVAX because we don't have enough vaccines. We need to produce more, much more than we have done so far. Now, my view is, and that is why I made the point in my speech when I spoke of incentives, I believe we need incentives for the respective companies to further invest into development. If in the situation of a pandemic, those who have been developing these vaccines with breathtaking speed, if we were to turn to them and say, you'll have to forsake your patents right now, I don't think that would be the best thing to do. You know, imagine we're talking companies here that have the capability to produce these vaccines, and all of a sudden we take away the patents from them. I think what we need is a kind of licensing. We have to make sure that those who don't grant licenses, that the governments then should be in a position to intervene and to make sure that we can then have compulsory licensing. But this is not what we're talking about, because the companies we are talking about are producing as best as they can to the limit of their abilities and also willing to grant licenses to any other company. We are talking about vaccines here. We're talking about sensitive goods. We have to make sure that quality assurance stays with us, with those who need to make sure that quality is maintained. What I want to see go out from this is a signal that the world acts in a spirit of solidarity. We have agreed to set up production capacities all over the world, also in Africa, in order to ensure that these countries are not dependent on production facilities outside their own continent. But I don't want the message to go out that in a next crisis situation, it is no longer worthwhile for companies to invest or to work hard to develop goods or produce or medicine, because what we want to make sure is that we produce in those sectors where it is most urgently required. We talked about this in greater detail. We focused on what we can do in order to fight the various diseases in Africa. No one in Africa has been carrying out any kind of research there. Once Ebola became a threat to us, we started thinking hard about how we can develop a vaccine. There are many diseases in Africa no pharmaceutical company is looking at or investing in. So what we have to make sure is to encourage pharmaceutical companies to invest their intellectual property into investments that benefit mankind at large. So as far as a waiver that would call into question patent protection is something that I don't think would help us here.
In the 1990s with HIV medicines, where it's not fully given up, the patent waivers, but it's made more affordable for productions in developing nations. How do you view that?
Well, as I said, granting licenses is of the utmost importance in that regard. Licensing fees are not being discussed at all right now. If things were to be sold at the highest bidder's price, but that is not what is happening. The companies are offering the products at a very low price, making it, adapting it to the respective countries' income, the medium or the low income countries. You see, I don't think that we can solve the problem of countries not having enough vaccines to go around to cover everyone. But look at the fact that we've been able to develop a vaccine in a very short period of time, less than a year's time, with a new technology, the mRNA technology. Of course, you cannot immediately vaccinate twice 7 billion people. But when I look at the promises that Mario Draghi made at his Global Health Summit, 1.3 billion doses to be made available by the end of the year on the part of the companies. I think that's a good first step.
The idea of urgency is one that we can also see Prime Minister Draghi in the climate issue. And you raised in your opening remarks that Italy will be a co-chair of the COP26 in Glasgow later this year. I was just wondering if you could be a bit more concrete about how do you see the efforts to sort of reconcile the challenge that we face on the one hand, that in the wake of this pandemic, we have enormous debt, countries are in recession around the globe, and at the same time, we need net zero by mid-century. And many countries view those efforts in climate change to actually be costly and an investment in governments. So how do we reconcile these two and get countries on board to cut emissions while at the same time investing and reviving their economies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Tackling climate change is a moral obligation. We owe it to our youth and to future generations. But it's also urgent for our economies. We want growth to be sustainable, and we know that the green transition can be itself an engine of economic growth. Italy, as G20 presidency and co-chair of COP26 with the United Kingdom, is working hard to pave the way for a historic goal, the commitment of G20 to climate neutrality with net zero emissions by 2050. It is a difficult challenge, given the diversity of views and national circumstances, which can make emission reductions costlier in some countries than others. But it is possible, also thanks to the recent decision from the US to return to the Paris Agreement. The Next Generation EU shows how the green transition can help to lift economic growth. As Italy, we decided to spend almost 40% of the resources on the ecological transition. This is over 75 billion euros in the next 5 years. So we are fully committed to this, and certainly the climate transition is a challenging task. But I want to stress something that Angela just said before. To win it, we need all actors. The EU itself is responsible for a relatively small part of global emissions. The others, the United States in this sense is very encouraging. They're joining back the Paris Agreement, but also China is an important actor in this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister Draghi. And the idea of the return of the United States to the Paris Agreement also moves into our next question that we have from Paolo Magri, who is the chair this year of the T20 in Italy. And he points out that while the Biden administration has returned and relaunched transatlantic relationships in a new spirit of cooperation, at the same time we're seeing Washington still maintains a much tougher stance on China than the EU does. And he's wondering, what impact do you think that this could have on multilateral efforts, both within the G20 or within the upcoming COP? And how do you propose, Chancellor Merkel, as you said at the Munich Security Conference, to devise a new joint agenda on China?
Ja, also ich glaube, dass wir
Well, I believe that as far as relations with China are concerned, on the one hand, we need to continue to aim for cooperation. Think of the issue of climate protection, think of the conference on biodiversity in Kunming in autumn this year, and other global challenges. Without China, we won't be able to tackle these challenges, and China is also part and parcel of a whole host of multilateral organizations. China is a member of G20, so rules governing our multilateral cooperation, even though we have different social systems from which we come, and even though we are competitors. And this competition issue, this character of competition, is something that the United States feel much more strongly than do we. China has become a power that did not exist per se in that dimension 20 years ago. So these systemic differences have to be clearly acknowledged, and we have to demand reciprocity. That is the idea that I try to focus on during our presidency of the Council, helping us trying to advance the investment agreement with China, because as a consequence, we get more reciprocity on markets. But at the same time, we have to think of intellectual property, fair competition, subsidies. These are all issues that need to be openly discussed and addressed, because if we don't do so, we will not be able to have a genuinely fair level of competition. The United States are making that point, and I think we will be able to make it together here and there. But sometimes, of course, we do have different interests, and there's no denying that fact. It's nothing bad in itself. China own social system, and here, when you look to the United States of America and the Western world, we do have a make the same response when it comes to criticizing disregard for human rights.
On this issue of China and the United States, how do you see the challenges being presented, or how do you propose to and the United States are each coming at this idea of how to deal with China?
Yes, I'll follow up on what I hinted before and what Angela has just said. The many challenges we've discussed today all require common ground as shared solutions, which are simply out of reach without the full engagement of the world's major economies. Just to mention one data, China accounts for about 70% of global GDP. It's also responsible for almost 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The issue, therefore, is not whether we should look for common ground with China, but rather how. We need to preserve a broad space for dialogue and cooperation, grounded on a shared understanding of the international rules-based order. Frank, open dialogue on issues ranging from finance to labor and digitalization is an essential tool to push these issues forward, without backing down from our open and democratic values, and without refraining from raising our European interests. COP26 that we will co-chair with the United Kingdom is a perfect example of a forum in which cooperation and common efforts are required, as I've had the chance to discuss recently with the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry. Thank you.
Thank you. A final question. So in 2018, Chancellor Merkel, you were speaking at this Global Solutions Forum, and you brought up the idea on the point of equity for women and gender equity, that one of the strongest and most important elements of this is that men need to change their attitudes about the division of labor and the traditional views that many men have of women's role in society. And Prime Minister Draghi this year has said, as part of the G20, the idea of gender equality, promoting women, is going to be one of the key issues. I'm just wondering, what advice could you give to him, having over 16 years been confronted time and again with this question, with the idea of how men can help in this entire effort, this global effort to improve women's equality around the world?
Thank you. Well, I really think governments have a lot to do. Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me? Did you want me to respond to Mario Draghi?
To Prime Minister Draghi of your advice that you would give him.
I'm pretty sure Angela would know much more about this and would give certainly a better response. But I think she would agree that governments have a lot to do in this direction. For example, removing existing barriers to women participation in the labor market and collaborating with the private sector to reduce gender discrimination on the workplace. Gender equality is one of the cross-cutting priorities of the Italian Recovery and Resilience Plan. We included specific measures, for example, investing in kindergartens and women's education. We also included a clause all across the plan, the EU plan, that will encourage companies that want to take part in the investment to hire more women and more youth. We are also, I wouldn't call it conditionality, but it gets very close to that. We are also trying to lead by example. For example, my government has appointed the first ever woman as head of the Secret Service. Thank you.
Do we have you back? Yeah. Yes, we've got you now. We lost you at the first ever woman as head of.
I said we like to lead by example, and to give you an example, my government has appointed as the first ever woman head of the Secret Service. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. We are low on time now. Unfortunately, it always goes faster than we would like. And in closing, I'd like to bring Dennis back to make a few final remarks. Thank you both.
I'd like to thank you because this was a very significant discussion, because this is a watershed, I believe, in the history of the G20. Never has the agenda of the G20 been quite as wide as this. You have referred to health, climate change, inequality, and there's been a common thread to what you've said, which is that economic prosperity can become decoupled from economic prosperity back to a recoupling, and to provide incentives, as both of you have said, on the health front and the climate front, and also on the inequality front, on the compact with Africa is really important. And this recoupling is the source of our latest version of the Global Solutions Journal, which I'd like to present to you digitally, and will do so physically. You have had a previous version of this in a past summit, and I'd like to thank you very much for this extremely important topic, and look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Thank you.
Ja, danke schön und schöne Grüße.
Thank you. And kind regards to the venue of the Global Solutions Summit, and my best regards go out to you, Mario.